Down. I was born in Bombay shortly after Indian independence into an Iraqi Jewish family whose ancestors came to India in 1785, some 185 years before I was born. I'm going to try and show you a picture of my ancestors quickly, just so you have a flavor of where I came from.
Yeah, I'm going to
Where?
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay, this is what I call my Alibaba photograph. Okay, so
Yeah,
that
perfect.
very fierce man in the middle is my great-great-great-grandfather. On his right is his son, my great-great-grandfather, and then on the far right, Manuel, can you move over, is my great-grandfather. So this is where I come from. This is how they would have looked when they were living in Baghdad. And as I said, I call it my Alibaba picture for obvious reasons. All the Jewish communities in India came because of persecution they suffered in their homelands. My ancestors, the Baghdadi Jews, came as a result of the persecution they suffered under some of the Turkish pashas who ruled over them, but also in search of new trading opportunities as India became part of the British Empire. But they were by no means the first or only Jews in India. The Malabari Jews of Cochin, the dark-skinned ones, came from Yemen in 70 AD and settled around Cranganore, which was a thriving port, some 450 miles south of Goa. The lighter-skinned Pardesi Jews also came to Cranganore, but from Spain after the Inquisition. Both communities were offered refuge in Cochin after the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century and threatened them with conversion or death. The Bene Israel tradition is that they are even an older community and arrived in India around 170 BC, fleeing persecution from Antiochus Epiphanes. They followed King Solomon's trade route, and 7 families were washed ashore on the west coast of India, nearer Bombay, when their ships and belongings were sunk in a monsoon. The Baghdadis, my lot, were undoubtedly, though, the most commercially successful of the Jewish migrants to India. The Bombay community was founded by Jacob Seemanism, who arrived in 1785 as a trader from Baghdad to Surat, then the largest trading port on the west coast of India. He was my great-great-great-grandfather. He moved his entire family permanently to Surat in about 1790, and then some years later moved to Bombay, some 180 miles south, which under British stewardship became the gateway to India, with its maritime links with Europe and Mesopotamia. Jacob Seema's business partner, Shalom Cohen, moved around the same time to establish a community in Calcutta, which had under the British become not only the capital of India, but the gateway to the Far East. Then followed waves of Baghdadi immigration to India, the most notable of which included the Sassoons, spearheaded by David Sassoon, who in 1828 had to flee Baghdad under cover of darkness and escaped to Bushir in Persia. In 1832, he moved his family to Bombay. I will relate the story of his escape from Baghdad only because it is straight out of a tale from the Arabian Nights. His father, Sheikh Ben Salah Sassoon, was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and his sister Farha was my 3-great-grandmother. The Sheikh held the position of Saraf Bashi, or chief treasurer, to a number of the pashas in Baghdad. And that position had been in the family for a couple of generations before him, until the last pasha, Dawood Pasha, who was a malign ruler, greedy and violent, and he forced the sheikh to resign his position. His son David was arrested and only released after a huge ransom was paid. Alerted to Dawood Pasha's intention to rearrest David, to extort even more money from the family, his father arranged for him to be smuggled out of Baghdad immediately on his release. The sheikh chartered a boat at an extortionate price to sail immediately for Basra, a 3-day journey down the river Tigris. David was disguised in a cloak and hood to avoid detection, and in the linings of his clothes were stitched money and pearls for his journey and his future. Only the captain of the boat knew the identity of this special passenger. Under cover of darkness, they slipped their moorings and set sail down the Tigris, heading for Basra. Sure enough, early the next morning, the Pasha's henchmen arrived at the Sheikh's house, and when they discovered that David had fled, they set sail immediately, but they were too late. David had escaped Dawood Pasha's clutches, and they were not able to catch up with him. The Wali of Basra was a colleague and sympathizer of Dawood Pasha, so David, a deeply religious man, stopped only long enough to go to synagogue to daven Marif, and promptly boarded another boat to Bushir in Persia, some 400 miles down and across the Gulf, where he would be firmly out of the Pasha's jurisdiction, and where he would be safe while he waited for his family to join him. David became the founder of the great Sassoon dynasty in India. From modest beginnings, he created an empire that spanned the world. He traded in spices, metalwork, carpets, and cotton goods. The British awarded him a license to export opium to China in exchange for silks and tea. He became very wealthy. He was very orthodox and traditional, and gave much more than the requisite 10% of his income to charity. He built schools, hospitals, institutes to educate Jews and Hindus in trades and crafts, and he built synagogues in Pune and Bombay. David Sassoon. Okay, we've got, so this is a library that exists until today. Can everybody see it?
No, we need to do what you did last time, Emmanuel.
I have.
Okay. His sons took his businesses to new heights and continued his philanthropic work and built incredible institutions which continue their good work until today. The Baghdadi community was joined by Jews from Yemen, Bukhara, Persia, and Afghanistan. So I grew up taking completely for granted that I was living amongst a very exotic mix of Jewish people. Many worked in the Sassoon mills and factories. Some were gem traders, others had their own import and export businesses. At its peak, there were between 5,000 and 7,000 Baghdadi Jews in Bombay. They were concentrated in two areas, one in Baikala, around the beautiful Magen David Synagogue and the Jacob Sassoon Free School, where the British and other businessmen originally settled to be near the docks, and the other, my community, in South Bombay, around the Knesset Eliyahu Synagogue, where Bombay's center of gravity moved when more and larger docks were built, and to where the city expanded in search of more space and fresher air. Life for the Jews in Bombay was comfortable and good. The Jewish club was the hub of the community's social activities, but at the same time, the community was fully integrated into the wider Hindu, Parsi, and Muslim communities with whom they worked and socialized. Indian independence in August 1947, the gradual Indianization of the country with its very strict exchange controls and the prohibition of the import of non-essential commodities resulted in making the traditional Jewish trades of import and export much more difficult. The Jews who had reached the peak of their economic and social powers under the British Raj found their positions undermined. It was partly because of their prior attachment to the British and partly because of the natural outburst of post-independence nationalistic fervor. The second most important event in the recent history of the Jews in India was the establishment of the State of Israel, when a spontaneous Zionistic feeling led to a large-scale emigration. So, while there was still a vibrant and active Jewish community while I was growing up, their exodus from India had already begun. So it was into this post-independence India that I was born. I have to say that my brothers and I feel that for us to have grown up in Bombay in the 50s and 60s was a privilege. And it was only after I left India that I realized that as a Jew, to have grown up in such an open, tolerant, non-judgmental society was exceptional and a real blessing. I basically lived two distinct lives in Bombay, but they were lives that intertwined seamlessly when they needed to. From Monday to Friday, I wore a secular hat. I went to the Cathedral and John Connon School, a church school, a school where I was the third generation of my family to attend. I was totally engaged in the school's academic and extracurricular activities. I played a lot of sport. I would wake early to train for athletics before school. I would often stay late after school, practicing with one sports team or another. The emphasis on academic study was paramount. But even so, we could take off all the days we wanted for the Hagim. In fact, even though in my class there were only 2 Jewish girls, in other classes there were sometimes more and sometimes fewer, the class teachers were instructed not to teach anything new during these religious absences. Needless to say, this applied to the other faiths as well, so we were mindful of all the Hindu, Jain, Parsi, Muslim holidays too. It was all completely natural. For Lent, the entire student body went to church every week. And again, the Jewish students were exempted from this, much to the envy of our classmates. We had assembly at school every morning, but it was mostly non-denominational. And when it was not, we just stood silently, not reciting the prayers. School lunch was available, but it was not compulsory. Some who lived far away brought what we call dry lunch, i.e. sandwiches. Some of us were lucky enough to have hot lunch from home delivered and served to us at 1 p.m. The cook would prepare delicious 3-course meals and wait with the other servants by the back gate to be let in to serve our lunch. He would set a proper place with table mats, napkins, glasses, and the appropriate cutlery. And then I would come out of class, wolf down these carefully prepared meals, and rush away to play netball or whatever. The poor chap, Kev, then had to provide the same service for my brothers in the boys' school. When I think of it now, I cringe at the thought of the work that went into providing me with a hot, delicious school lunch, and at the scant attention or appreciation I showed for it. My only consolation is that my cook knew how fond I was of him, and that there was nothing he would not do for me. When I was in college, I would sometimes call home mid-morning, bypass my mother, who was at work anyway, and tell him I'd like to bring 10 or 12 people home for lunch. After the mildest protest, he asked that we would come between 1:30 and 2 to give him time to prepare a feast. By the time I left India in 1969, he had been with the family for over 50 years. At home, we ate mostly Iraqi food, often flavored with Indian spices. Our cook was a fabulous Iraqi cook, but our favorite dish was his Mangalorean fish curry, which was so spicy that we would have tears streaming down our cheeks as we ate it. Given that many Indians are strict vegetarians, it made socializing very easy. But even for those who were not, never once was I offered anything unsuitable, nor did anyone make me feel at all awkward about my dietary requirements. And of course, they often came to us for meals, which they enjoyed because it was so different to what they ate at home. We lived in South Bombay, in a not particularly Jewish area, and in our block of flats, our neighbors were Hindus, Parsis, Muslims, and Christians. We became our own mini multicultural society way before that became a catchphrase. My mother opened our home to everyone in the neighborhood, and our home became the clubhouse for all the neighborhood kids, and to congregate for companionship, for games, for advice, for anything, for nothing. We all learned very naturally about our different festivals and customs and made sure that they were all respected and observed. Non-Jewish friends who tried to duck out of any family ceremonies were quickly dispatched home to take part. And the same happened if we were discovered not observing Jewish traditions. In fact, I was very amused when about 10 years ago, at the 150th anniversary of our school, a Muslim friend said to me that friends in her conservative Muslim community in Hong Kong, where she was now living, were sure that she had Jewish blood in her because she was so au fait with all the Jewish holidays and observances, with the laws of kashrut, etc. She had been in and out of our house all the time. It was only natural that she would know about them. There was another occasion where my brother was walking to synagogue one Shabbat morning, and he got caught up watching a cricket match. He was so absorbed in the match that he did not notice a Hindu neighbor on her early morning walk come up alongside him. She tugged at his arm and asked him what he thought he was doing, and ordered him to synagogue at once, or warned that she would report him to his mother. Brian had no choice but to obey. This is just another example of how integrated we were in each other's lives. I went to school and college in Bombay because although my brothers left when they were 17 to go to Harvard, Mum thought 17 was a bit young for me to leave home alone. Remember, there were no mobiles, no WhatsApp, FaceTime, or anything like that to keep in touch. Only trunk calls, which had to be booked in advance, which rarely were connected on the same day, and which usually came through in the middle of the night. And letters, which took a while to be delivered. America and England seemed very far away. So it was only at the age of 19 that I left Bombay to study abroad. I left with only the official allowance of £3.50 in my pocket, because there were very strict exchange controls, and it did feel like quite an adventure. But it also meant that all my formative years were spent in Bombay, which is probably why I have such a deep bond with India and my Indian friends. So from Friday afternoon to Sunday, I wore my Jewish hat. My grandmother lived about 15 minutes away from us by car. And when she was in Bombay, she often traveled to England to see her children and grandchildren living there. We would decamp to her house for Shabbat. We did not go to synagogue for Kabbalat Shabbat, but would join her as she sang her way through the service at home. She had a beautiful voice, and I still sometimes close my eyes and recall her voice when I hear Ellie singing a tune she used to sing. Shabbat morning in synagogue was de rigueur, not because I remember anyone saying we had to go, but because something everybody did. We did not have any religious divisions like Orthodox or Reform or Liberal. I didn't even know that such divisions existed until after I left India. Everyone in the South Bombay community went to the one synagogue, even though many had different levels of observance. Shachrit began at 6:45. Yes, 6:45 a.m., but I never made it before 7:45 or 8, and that was early enough, and it was all over by 9. Since we observed Shabbat quite strictly, it was a great opportunity to socialize. The day ahead was long, so either I would go to a friend's house or invite friends over to mine. We all returned to synagogue in the evening for Oneg Shabbat and Havdalah. Knesset Eliyahu is a very beautiful synagogue situated on the first and second floors of an imposing Gothic purpose-built building from the 1880s. It has a mikveh and a terrace on which each year a sukkah was constructed. On the ground floor were synagogue offices and rooms that we used for our Habonim get-togethers. An example of how welcome the Jews in Bombay were made to feel. The state transportation company would issue books of tickets, which could be bought in advance to enable Jews to travel on buses and trams without having to use any money. The community in Bombay did not all live within walking distance of the synagogue, and so this enabled them to attend on Shabbat and festivals.
Can you see that?
It's a real pity because I've got a picture of a ticket.
Can you see the ticket?
Yeah.
No, we can see it, but it's very small. Again,
It basically says Bombay Municipality, the BESC, which was the transport company, undertaking 1 anna coupon for Jews only to be used on Saturdays and Jewish holidays. It was really quite something. We had a very active and fun Habonim group. I know that Habonim in every country other than India is a left-wing, non-religious organization. In Bombay, it was religious and very conservative. So every Saturday evening, we would gather in the Habonim room on the ground floor of the synagogue and make Havdalah, and then sing Hebrew songs to welcome the week and other songs, very often from the Palmach time. The doors of the Habonim room opened onto a not very busy street. We would inevitably spill out onto the street and organize into Israeli dancing, singing as we went. The fact that we were on a public street, gathering an audience of passers-by, mattered not at all. We just sang and danced until it was time to go home. Sunday morning was Heder, although that's not what we called it. We simply said we were going to Habonim. We would gather around 10 o'clock for an hour of Bible stories, half an hour of Hebrew, and then more singing and dancing. There was always some festival or other to prepare for, so there were endless song sheets, the words in Hebrew and in transliteration, so we learned songs for all the festivals and more. Once a month, there'd be a picnic. We would all meet at the train station and travel out to the beach or a park. In the park, in a suburb called Borivali, we would find shade under large tamarind trees and pick the ripe pods right off the trees and suck the sweet, sour tamarind flesh until our teeth got on edge. Oh, we loved doing that. We brought our own food and drink. My cook's mixed vegetable chutney sandwiches were very popular. So inevitably, my brothers and I took enough for the whole group, and we would always sing in Hebrew on our journeys there, our journeys back, on the trains, while we were in the park, while we were walking to the park. Also, a few times a year, the Madrichim would organize Bombay-wide treasure hunts. This took a lot of planning. Clues were hidden around the city, up trees, in pipes, behind monuments, at bus stops, etc., etc. We would be divided into 3 or 4 groups, starting with one clue, which led to another and another. The teams were always of mixed ages because there was no way us younger ones could have managed on our own, because we would sometimes need to travel by tram or bus. And anyway, we would never have been able to decipher, let alone reach all the clues. The Madrichim were on hand with hints to stop any one group falling far behind. We often had parties in the evenings when there would be mixed dancing, and some of the so-called chaperones would walk around with 6-inch rulers to make sure no one danced too closely. It was all so simple and innocent. The cherry on the cake of the Habonim year was a 2-week camp in Matheran, a hill station near Bombay. Matheran, literally meaning forest on the forehead, is a completely unpaved hill station. No motorized vehicles were allowed, and we usually walked everywhere, often dodging the rickshaws and horses that were alternative available transports. On the rough red-made paths and under low overhanging trees, which provided a wonderful leafy canopy to protect us from the sun and to provide shelter for the troops of monkeys that inhabited them. The hill has a flat tabletop with beautiful views from different points around the perimeter. Walking to capture the views from these points with names like One Tree Hill and Porcupine Point and Charlotte Lake is what Matheran, being in Matheran, is all about. For example, Panorama Point offers wonderful views of the mountains of the Western Ghats. And Louisa Point has views of the waterfalls of an ancient fort, a relic from the time of the Maratha warrior Shivaji. Each December, we would travel to camp by train from Bombay's wonderful Gothic Victoria Terminus station to Neral at the foot of the mountain, and then transferred to a single gauge steam train to the top. This little train chugged its way around the hill, making 2 water stops along the way. The older boys would walk up much more quickly than the train, but the luggage and all the paraphernalia we needed for a 2-week kosher camp, and us younger campers, took the train. Manuel wanted me to include a picture, which we can't show you, of a sign to One Kiss Tunnel. We sometimes went through tunnels, and one was so short that some funny guy named it the One Kiss Tunnel. Habonim rented one of 2 houses in Matheran. Which one we got depended on how much damage we had left behind us the year before, and whether we were quicker off the mark than the rival Bnei Akiva group. My favorite house was one called the Dell, which was at the bottom of a rough path through a forest of trees. We were divided into 4 kibbutzot, Older boys, older girls, younger girls. We slept in dormitories with our kibbutzer. Our days were prescribed. We woke at 6, and by 6:30, we girls were lined up making sandwiches for breakfast while the boys dove and sharit. Making breakfast was always a bit of a challenge. The bread was delivered fresh from the market, as was the butter. So given how cold it was outside, the butter was almost always frozen. The bread was so fresh that we could only cut thick slices. Then, because it was so frozen, a slice of butter, then some jam and 2 slices of cheese, then another slice of butter, and then another slice of bread. They weren't sandwiches, they were doorstops, and the boys complained every single day. But we really were right in the middle of the forest, and it was not unusual to wake and find an entire snake skin that a molting snake had wriggled out of and left behind in our bathroom. When we found one of these, we were freaked out for a while, wondering where the snake was, or even to find panther prints across the yard outside the house. At 10 o'clock, we had a 2-hour study session. We had to do tests, take tests at the end of camp. This period was designated for what was called cultural work, but which we campers called kachra work. Kachra in Hindi means rubbish. Between 12 and 1, we would play baseball on the police grounds or walk to one or the other of the points, and then we had lunch. The camp cook, Regina, was also Iraqi Jewish, spoke mostly Arabic and Hindi. She ruled in her kitchen block with her vivid hennaed hair, wearing the Iraqi floor-length dresses, and often found her stirring huge cauldrons of food for all of us hungry campers. She was a great Iraqi cook. To ensure the provision of kosher meals, a couple of the madrichim were trained shochetim. We would sometimes watch the chickens being slaughtered, watch them running around for a few minutes after they'd been shechted, after which we would run away screaming. I'm amazed that we did not become lifelong vegetarians. We had a 2-hour rest time every afternoon when we would have to prepare for the evening's entertainment, a fancy dress or a pantomime or socials or whatever, and we had to be very creative and spontaneous, and it was great fun. On Friday mornings, we spent the day scrubbing the house and ourselves thoroughly in preparation for Shabbat, which we observed very strictly. In the late afternoon, we would have a parade in the grounds in front of the house, when we would march by kibbutzer, dressed in crisp navy and white, shoes cleaned and polished to the best of our ability, and march to the beat of our kibbutzer song to form a square around a flagpole, raise the Israeli flag, and sing the Habonim anthem and the Hatikva. Then we would go straight into Kabbalat Shabbat, dinner, benching in bed before the clocks on the lights plunged us into the deep blackness of the forest. Shabbat was a welcome change in the daily routine of the camp. We had no chores. We went for long walks, caught up on sleep, hung out, or just relaxed. When camp was over, we went back to Bombay, and the annual cycle of Habonim activities continued. I never graduated to the older girls group, Kvutza Sarah, because by the time I was 13 or 14, there were not enough youngsters to organize camp for, and most of the madrichim had left India, and the community had dwindled quite substantially. I've been trying to remember some of the differences in how we celebrated the festivals. Purim was pretty much the same as here, except we didn't have any Gregors, so we just stamped our feet very loudly to drown out Haman's name. One clever clogs in the community, when asked why we did this, said it was because Haman was buried under the synagogue. So we had to stamp extra hard, and when we were young, we believed him. Pesach was a little different. For one thing, there were absolutely no substitutions available. So if something was not allowed, we did without. We ate no processed foods of any kind, no butter or cheese, except for the plaited cream cheese that was handmade at home. But being Sephardi, we ate kitniot, rice, beans, lentils. Our matzah was made by one lady under strict supervision and was a large, flattish circle. Our Pesach orders were delivered in large pillowcases. The Seder itself followed the same recounting as elsewhere, except we had a few different customs. The Seder plate was the same, except our haroset, as we called halek, was made of a thick date syrup, covered in a layer of crushed walnuts. Oh, it was delicious. As the youngest in the family, I was sent out of the house with a large napkin containing some matzah tied over my shoulder. I had to bang on the door, and when I heard my grandmother shout, "Come in," I would run to the dining room. I would be asked, "Where have you come from?" I'd say, "Egypt." "Where are you going to?" I'd say, "Israel." "What are your provisions?" At which point I would open the napkin I was carrying to show the matzah, and I then had to recite Manishtana. Then when we came to the plagues, we didn't dip our fingers into our wine glasses. Instead, we covered the glasses and all the food on the table to protect it from being contaminated by the plagues. And the celebrant, my grandmother, would pour a little wine into a glass jar for each plague. Then she would screw a lid on the jar, place it in a bag, and throw it out of the window to smash in the courtyard below. My grandmother's building was built around an inner courtyard, which was open to the sky, which held the water tanks, and was also where the building servants congregated to chat. There were Jewish families in the 2 flats below Granny's, and we could always tell where each family was up to in the Seder by the sound of smashing jars. We had to laugh one time when 3 jars smashed within minutes of each other, and a plaintive voice from down below shouted in Hindi, "What's going on?" Breakfast was the biggest treat. We would have the thinnest pancakes made of ground rice flour, filled with the date syrup and topped with generous helpings of walnuts, and then rolled and eaten. Oh, they were the best. I remember that for Tisha B'Av, the whole synagogue was draped in black, and we would all sit on the floor. And for Rosh Hashanah, the whole synagogue was draped in white. For Simchat Torah, all the Sifrei Torah were brought out of the Aron Kodesh and placed on a semicircular, tiered and decorated stand in front of the Aron Kodesh. I remember about 20 or so Sifrei Torah. My brother remembers more. Whatever it was, there were many. On Simchat Torah, all the women joined the men downstairs for the Hakafot. The women standing on one side, but not strictly apart. The Hakafot grew merrier and more raucous with each circuit, because many of the men had hip flasks out of which they swigged whiskey and brandy during each circuit. India had total prohibition at the time, so it was quite funny to see this display of disobedience by otherwise staid members of the community. A very nice custom was that at the end of each Shabbat and festival service, the women would go down to the men's level when the Aron Kodesh would be opened for us, and we were able to kiss the Sifrei Torah and recite private prayers. The Aron was about 5 or 6 deep marble steps up, and when we descended, we would never turn our backs to the Aron, so we had to carefully descend backwards. We never had a rabbi in our community, so we never had sermons. The service was run by a Hazan when we had one, and after he retired, by various members of the community. The teenage boys had to be fairly well versed in the prayers because they could be called on at a moment's notice. An interesting custom was that all the aliyot were auctioned. There was no membership fees, so this was a useful way of raising funds for the synagogue. The auction was held during the service in Arabic, and the money was paid over after Shabbat. A very mischievous custom was to tease a prospective bar mitzvah that if someone outbid him for his portion, he would have to learn another one. Obviously, it was a community in-joke, otherwise it would have been too cruel, but the men put up a pretty good pretense, and my brother still remembers a heart-stopping moment when the bidding for his bar mitzvah portion went so high that he got nervous, and he looked up to Mum for help, and she just smiled calmly back at him. After reciting his bar mitzvah, and after being pelted with a hail of sweets, the bar mitzvah boy then went to each elder in the community to be blessed. And then he had to do the same with the elder women in the community. In the ladies' gallery upstairs, it was a very sweet and respectful custom, although the boys hated the big wet kisses that the older Iraqi women planted on their cheeks. Unfortunately, Throughout the 1950s, the community bled members. Young people, men and women, went abroad to study and didn't return. Their job prospects were better abroad. Families did not want to be split up, so then families started to leave together. There were very strict exchange controls, so families would slowly liquidate all their assets and buy US dollars on the black market, or if they had limited finances, they would buy gemstones and bake them in sambusaks, which were three-cornered pastries, to smuggle them out in that way. There were so many stories of people being very creative in order to smuggle out their own funds to help them in their new lives. When we knew of such a traveler, the community would collectively hold its breath until the flight took off and it was confirmed that they were on it. My favorite story of all is of a dentist who was making Aliyah to Israel with his family. Because of the strict exchange controls, he persuaded the authorities to allow him to take his dentist chair and equipment as checked luggage on the plane with him so that he could set up shop and start earning money immediately. The plane was already out of Indian airspace when the authorities tried to get the pilot to return. The dentist chair had been reupholstered and packed full of US dollars. Their information came too late. That was a great result. After my brothers left India, my mother and I stayed behind. I was still in school. And then I began to go to Mum's cousin in Cochin for a month every year during the school summer holidays. I became an honorary Cochini, and I'm still in close touch with the community, which is now mostly in Israel. They're a wonderfully warm, inclusive, and hospitable community. Cochin was a little gem of a community. They always hovered between 250, 350 people, and being Orthodox, they never married out. So everyone was related to each other. My aunt and uncle lived in a large red Dutch colonial house on the waterfront in Cochin. Their house overlooked the famous Chinese fishing nets. From their balcony, we would see porpoises playing in the water and flying fish like silvery streaks skimming across the water. Ships coming into Cochin Harbour would sail gracefully by. There were islands across this stretch of water, and we would sometimes go there to take part in colourful Hindu festivals or to visit small cottage industries, weaving koya matting and making other handicrafts. The family owned the ferry rights across this body of water, and it always amused me that the boats were named after the women in the family. So we would very likely take a boat called Lily or Gladys or Essie or Queenie across. But alas, no more. The ferries have been nationalized. We would sometimes go for a weekend to their house in Alleppey on the Kerala backwaters, where we would swim in the river to cool off. I remember one time when somebody yelled, "Elephants!" and we had to scramble out of the water hastily to avoid them. The elephants, there must have been 3 or 4 or 5 of them, I don't know, were headed straight for us. It was quite a moment. Most of the Cochin community lived in what is called Jewtown, a narrowish street of terraced houses, ending in the Pardesi synagogue, for which Cochin is so famous. That's where I spent a lot of time, in Jewtown. Every home had a stable door, and only the bottom half was closed to keep their dogs indoors. I would call out through the open half to see who was around to hang out with, and that way spent lovely, long, lazy days with them all. I was there during the 6-Day War in 1967, and I have a clear memory of the community gathered very solemnly, talking in hushed tones in the middle of the street, turning their radios this way and that to improve the signal to get the latest news on the progress of the war in Israel. In Bombay, at the same time, non-Jewish Indian men lined up in their thousands outside the Israeli consulate to get visas to volunteer in Israel to keep the country running while the Israelis were serving on the fronts, defending their country. Fortunately, this was a swift victory and their help wasn't needed, but it was very inspiring to see the regard in which the Jews and Israel were held. I know it was a very small picture that was posted to advertise this talk, but it's basically a picture that was taken of me in the Cochini bride's dress. I was one of 4 girls as an honorary Cochini, dressed up in the traditional bride's dress to welcome the Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, when she came to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the synagogue. It was a wonderful affair, and the synagogue was dressed up with colorful silk sarongs lining the walls. The bridal outfit is stunning. It comprises a heavily gold embroidered white silk sarong, a short blouse similarly decorated, but with a low neck, which had to be covered with a lot of jewelry to preserve the bride's modesty. The whole community contributed to this collection of jewelry to make the most breathtaking look. Emmanuel and I went to Cochin 18 months ago for the 450th anniversary of the synagogue. There are sadly only 2 members of the community left in Cochin, but for this, 200 plus Cochinis and their descendants from Israel, Australia, Vancouver, America, and England joined the festivities. And the synagogue was full of Cochinis for the first time since 1972, when their rather rapid exodus resulted in the eventual decline of the community. The atmosphere was electric. The celebrations began on Thursday evening with hakafot in the courtyard around this little jewel of a synagogue. Such was the level of excitement that everyone being reunited, that the volume of singing and greeting was deafening. By Shabbat, the men of the community who could have read from the Torah had lost their voices, and they asked Emmanuel to do the laning for them. Cochin is another beautiful story. So apart from these annual visits in Cochin, and apart from observing Shabbat and the festivals, I was then able to participate fully in what the wider non-Jewish community of Bombay had to offer. Life in Bombay was very sociable, and there were lots of parties and picnics. School took up a lot of my time, sports took up even more. I sat for O-level, set and corrected by the Cambridge board in England. My mother still considered I was too young to go abroad alone, albeit to the protection of a college campus. So I went to Elphinstone College to read economics and statistics. My grandmother and her siblings had also attended Elphinstone College in the late 1800s and early 1900s. In fact, Granny was the first woman fellow of Elphinstone College in 1903. She had been warned by her very autocratic father that if she insisted on a college education, no man would marry her, and he forbade it. Fortuitously, she spied an advertisement in the Times of India, posted by a Parsi girl, appealing for another female to join her in college because her father would not allow her to be the only woman in amongst all these men. My very determined grandmother responded, and the rest is history, as they say. Lucky for us, she had a great marriage with an Iraqi man called Saul Gurji, who came to India in 1904, or none of us would be here to tell the tale. I left India in '69 to study for a year in the States, and then because the tumult of the Vietnam War and its disturbances on campuses, the drugs and the alcohol scene, so greatly alarmed this protected ingenue abroad for the first time, that I beat a hasty retreat to England and completed my studies here. And I've lived here ever since. I try to return to India as often as I can. I did not manage to last year, and it looks like COVID-19 might prevent a visit this year. My friends there, all non-Jewish now, are like my family. And I return for weddings, class reunions, school reunions, significant birthday celebrations, and for any excuse I can find. When I go to Bombay, a city that never sleeps, I listen to the sounds of the city, I breathe in the polluted air, and I think, yippee, I'm home. When I lived in Bombay, there were 4 million people living there. Now there are 24 million. The city bristles with activity. It's a beautiful city with the most wonderful Gothic architecture, the most beautiful collection of Art Deco buildings, and it's now designated a World Heritage Site. It has a heart and soul that is unmatched anywhere I have been. Of the Baghdadi community, there are now fewer than 20 souls left in Bombay. It's very sad. Our beautiful synagogue had deteriorated so much that it took the generosity of a philanthropic Hindu family to pay for its restoration. It is stunning once again. Chabad has come to Bombay, and I suppose that in time they will take over the running of the synagogue. I just hope that they will respect our very ancient Baghdadi customs. So that's me and my time in India. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free.
Thank you, Edwina. It's Lawrence. Well, it's a very odd thing to do this to a computer screen, but I really want to. That really was very special, very colourful. You painted wonderful pictures, and seriously, I can't thank you enough. Can I just ask you, what language did you speak at home?
I spoke English at home. I went to an English medium school, but we needed to learn Hindi to talk to the servants and on the street.
But with your friends, it was English?
It was English, yeah. And they spoke English at home too.
It's not
Edwina, Izzy here.
Hi, Izzy. You'll recognize some of it.
I did.
Did you go to Bene Akiva?
Yes, I was too young for that at the time.
Oh, okay.
And I remember, of course, when you were mentioning Seder, and I used to be the youngest, and my dad would send me out with the napkin around my shoulder,
Yeah.
and come in and say it brought it all back. And I was only four years old, and I remember this now. And of course, Matheran, I used to go there with my brothers. And of course, the halak that you mentioned, which was my mother used to make, and the samosas with the coconut. And of course, my brother and I would jump on the garigora, which is the horse trucks, not the horse trucks. How can I describe it?
There were horse-drawn carriages.
That's right. So
Yeah.
my other brother and I would jump on the back to get a free ride either to the station or go into my dad's office. It was incredible. It was a different lifestyle there. All the Jews, the Muslims, the Hindus, all got on. And we lived next to, not far from David Sassoon's main synagogue, Milf South. We were near Kalaba, not far from Jehu. And of course, it was a different time. And as you so rightly put it, it was beautiful. It was home. It was home. And you described everything so beautifully. Thank you. Really, thank you.
I hope it brought back memories, Izzy. I have wonderful memories of India.
So do I. And they're beautiful. Whenever I can go back, I used to go back. And hopefully next year, Eva and I will go. I like to take my kids, even though some of them will love it, some of them won't, but the majority, they all will. It's a beautiful country, and everyone who's listening should go. It's the nicest, warmest, friendliest people in the world, and they don't care what religion you are. Not in
Right.
those,
Yeah.
but very friendly, and it's lovely.
Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions?
One thing I wanted to ask you is about something that we found on our last visit, which I think was several years ago, was Calcutta, which I've been to Cochin, I've been to Bombay, I've seen the shuls in both places, but nothing prepared me for the visit to Calcutta, because no one even mentioned it. We were walking down the road one day when we happened to see on the side of the road, carved in stone above all the vendors' things on the pavement, something called I think it was Beth El Synagogue or something.
Yes.
So I said to the guide who was walking with us, I said, "Is that a synagogue? Can we go in?" So he said yes. And to cut a long story short, we went round the corner and into a compound which had two absolutely enormous shuls. I mean, much, much larger than anything I've seen in Bombay or in Cochin. And when we were there, a young Indian photographer said, who was there photographing, he said, "There's a third synagogue very near here." So in the middle of Calcutta, there are three of the most enormous restored synagogues, restored by an American committee, completely unused, now looked after by the Indian Antiquities Commission or something, or Cultural Commission. These and a huge history of, again, Jews from Iraq who had this enormous community, now reduced to 17 people. They're not
Is it as many as 17, Brian?
if that. And but it is the most overwhelming thing I've seen in, you know, Jewish connection in India. These enormous, preserved, restored shuls, which are simply amazing. So what do you know about the Calcutta community?
Well, we had family in Calcutta. I went to Calcutta for the first time, what, 10, 15 years ago. As I said, the two communities started at the same time. My great-great-great-grandfather started Bombay and his partner went to Calcutta so that they could take advantage of the two. They were never as numerous as Bombay's. Bombay was always the primary one. But they were very successful and very prosperous. And of course, a lot of the opium trade went from Calcutta. So, you know, opium was legal, so whatever. But that's where a lot of them made a lot of money. But nobody anymore.
Right.
Edwina, are we on?
Yeah.
Yes,
I've also had an interesting experience in Ahmedabad, where I was working last year.
Yeah.
And on the Friday, I attended the Friday night synagogue at this service at their synagogue when I was working there, and it was amazing. It's a small community. They have a minyan on a Friday night. Apparently, there are 126 Jews in the city, and they run most of the schools.
Now, they are Bnei Israels. They're not Baghdadis. And they were, there must have been 100,000 of them at one point. Yeah. They are mostly in Israel now. The Bnei Israels are a very interesting community because for 1,500 years, they lived almost anonymously, clinging to their old traditions. They had the Shema, they kept kashrut, they circumcised their children. They were known as the Saturday oilmen because they lit candles on Shabbat and they didn't do any work. And it was only, I think in the sort of 17th century, there was an Cochini spice trader, David Rahabi, who came across them and thought, who are these people? And he gave them all sorts of tests and said to them, you know, I think you're Jewish, do you want to learn more? And they said, yes, yes, yes. But they are completely assimilated. They were completely assimilated. But there's another very interesting, I don't know if we've got time, about one of the members of this Bnei Israel community as previously. And then when they became more educated and got more involved in their Judaism, they moved to Bombay to get better work. And a couple of them joined the British Army. And they fought with them in the south against Tipu Sultan's soldiers. And Tipu Sultan, of course, being Muslim. And they were defeated. And prisoners of war at that time were jailed and killed. Tipu Sultan's mother heard that there were 2 Jewish men in the jails. And she went to her son and she said, you cannot kill them. These are people of the book. They are like us. In the meantime, these people had said, the one brother said that if he ever got out alive, he would build the first Bnei Israel synagogue. And because of Tipu's mother knowing her Bible, they escaped and they built the first Bnei Israel synagogue, which is in Bombay.
Oh, Edwina, can I just say, it's Edna Turnberg here.
Hi, Edna. Hi.
Hi. That was absolutely wonderful.
Oh,
really, it was so interesting. I admire how you remember every little detail from your background, having come from another country where I remember very little. It was just fascinating.
But I renew it, Edna, because I go back so often.
Yes.
And as Manuel will stay, he will attest to that when we get together with people from Bombay, all we do is talk about old times.
Yeah,
and Manuel plays on his phone because he says he's heard all the stories 100 times before.
Yes. Anyway, it was wonderful to listen to you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
Because we were in Cochin maybe 10 years ago, and they managed to get a minyan for a service. So we had a wonderful Friday night service at Cochin Synagogue, and it was really very colourful on Jew Street. So we were
Jewtown. Jewtown is the most extraordinary place. I don't know how much they told you about the synagogue, but basically you saw the SHtory, which are solid silver cases. If the photographs had worked, I'd have shown them. Each one has a gold jewel crown. Did you see them, Patty? No. Each one has a gold jewel crown, and each crown came from a different local Maharaja as a token of his goodwill. The blue and white tiled floors of the synagogue came from the Maharaja of Travancore as a token of his goodwill.
Yes, so they were very proud of the blue and white tiles.
But also the SHtory. I mean, it's amazing. And when the Jews came to Cochin, when they were running away from the Portuguese, the Cochin Maharaja gave them this plot of land on the other side of his palace walls because he said he liked the sound of Jewish prayers. So if you looked, I mean, you may not have noticed it, but the clock tower, the synagogue facing Jewtown, is in Hebrew letters, but facing the palace is in Malayali letters, numbers. It was such a wonderful community.
Yes, fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lawrence, can I just recommend something?
Yes, of course.
It's a book. I don't remember whether it was about a Jewish family, but it's all about the opium trade in Calcutta.
Yeah.
And it's
Flowers in the Blood.
Yes. What is it about a Jewish family?
It's about the Sassoons in Calcutta. Yeah.
Yeah, it is brilliant. It's
What's it called? Please.
Flowers in the Blood.
Flowers in the Blood
by Gay Corter.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
It's out of print, but you can get it on Kindle.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Marilyn. Well, I think we've gone past 12 o'clock.
Sorry, guys.
No, it's wonderful.
No,
it was really very, very special, Edwina. Seriously, I loved every minute of it. Everybody did.